In this video, I'll show you how to make a stamped slab plate. Start with a thick, solid piece of clay and pound it out using your fist or a mallet until you have a consistently thick slab of dense clay to work with. You can use a rolling pin to smooth out the surface if you like. Then create your texture using a plaster or bisqueware stamp or by rolling some other roulette or material across the surface. Once you've completely covered the surface of your slab with the texture, we'll stretch it to distort this pattern. You can stretch the slab by tapping it or throwing it down against your work surface. And this distorted pattern is interesting because sometimes a stamp can be a bit plain if the texture is too regular or too even. But this just depends on what you're going for and what your aesthetic is. To stretch the slab, throw it down against the surface at a 45-degree angle, and you should see the pattern start to distort. Be sure to rotate the slab continuously so you're not stretching it more in one direction than you'd like. Depending on the texture and moisture content of your clay, you may start to see small cracks forming on the surface where this texture is being stretched. So be sure to monitor that and don't let them get out of control. As when throwing any slab, you want to be careful with how you lift the slab back up off the table because you don't want to leave deep fingerprints in the edges of your plate. So be gentle and kind of use that outer lip that's forming by stretching the slab as your handle. Once you're satisfied with the stretched texture of your slab, you can find something to use as a drape mold. In this case, I have a bisqueware piece of clay that I have thrown on the wheel to create the inner curve of a plate. If you don't have something like this custom made, you can consider using already existing plates or mixing bowls or even a piece of canvas cloth draped over another form to give you the curve that you're looking for. Whatever form you choose to use, be sure that it's a porous surface so that the wet clay doesn't stick. You may run into trouble if you're trying to use a glass bowl. If that is the case, you can try dusting cornstarch over the surface of something like glass to prevent the clay from sticking. Now in this stage, I want to press the slab down over the form so that I get the form that I like. But if I press too hard, I'm going to end up erasing the slab texture that I've just spent all that time creating. So I want to use kind of a gentle pressure, just enough to shape the piece, but not enough to erase that texture. Next, I'll use my needle tool to trim off the excess clay around the edges. As soon as I'm done, I'll be sure to bag up any scraps so that I don't have to reclaim them. They're still wet enough in this stage that I can just wedge them up again. Now I'm using a wet sponge to smooth out some of my fingerprints from pressing the slab over the form. Again, using a gentle pressure so I'm not erasing the stamp texture on the other side, but just enough to smooth out that form and give an even underside to the plate. This clay is relatively fine grained, so I'm not too worried about this sponge drawing out any of the grog texture, although I don't want to use a whole lot of water, just enough to make a smooth surface. Next, I thought the rim of this plate was still rather thick, and so I'm using a cheese cutter here. It's just a wire tool on a frame, and I'm going to use that to bevel the edge, making it a little bit thinner, both visually and physically. If you don't have a cheese cutter, you can use your wire tool, or you could try to thin out that edge using a brayer or the loop tool or anything else that's handy. Again, I'll use a sponge to smooth out that edge that I just cut. Now I'm going to add a foot. So I've rolled out a smooth coil that's relatively thin. I guess it's about the thickness of a finger. And I'm going to score right around the edge of that plate. This will make it easier to pick up and set down. And it'll also visually just make it more interesting as it lifts itself up off the table. This is the main advantage of working with a hump mold, where the wet clay is face down over the mold, is that it gives you access to the base, where you could add a foot in the same stage of the drying process. You can also work with slump molds, where the slab is draped into a concave mold face up, but then you have to wait for that to harden before you can flip it over if you're trying to add a foot or address the base. Just like when making a coil pot, I'm going to score and slip carefully and press firmly down to make sure the attachment will hold. And then I'll probably do a couple more laps just to really secure that attachment and smooth that surface. Lastly, I'll take the wet sponge and smooth that coiled foot out as well. For the sake of this demo, I'm going to leave it a little bit rough, but if this were your finished piece, you would want to take the time to refine the textures on the surfaces, even on the base, before you let it dry. When ceramic artists look at other people's work, often the first thing they do is turn it over to see if the base is as finished as the top. So don't leave anything down there that you wouldn't want somebody to find later. Here's the finished plate. I will likely go and smooth out this rough upper rim, but you get this sense of how the foot has lifted this form up off the table, and that stretched stamped texture gives it a little bit of vitality beyond the normal stamping pattern.